I'm Karen Taylor. I'm Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm so pleased to welcome you all here this evening. We have an absolutely wonderful turnout in person and also online. So we really have a bumper audience tonight, and I'm very grateful to our speaker for bringing in such a large crowd, and indeed to the Art Deco Society of New York. And as I just implied, we are partnering tonight with the Art Deco Society of New York. But before I introduce Roberta Newsome, who's going to say a few words about the Art Deco Society of New York and introduce our speaker, Anthony Robbins, I'm just going to give you a summary of the General Society, a précis of some of the things that we do. For those of you who are less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785. That is 239 years ago. Today, our organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life for the people of the City of New York through our various educational and cultural programs. These include our lecture series, of which of course tonight is part of, and our lecture series originally started in 1838, so you see it's got quite a distinguished history. You are in our General Society library, which not too long ago celebrated 200 years. You also have the Lock Museum, that is a John M. Mossman Lock Museum, that you're welcome to visit after tonight's program. And finally, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute. That's a quick summary of all our programs. And again, before I introduce Roberta, a quick reminder to mute your phones. It is now my huge pleasure to introduce to you Roberta Newsome.
Good evening. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and for giving us the overview of the Society. The Art Deco Society of New York cannot claim to be anywhere near as old, but we try to be very, very active. And Tony will tell you a little bit about the origins. By your comparison, we're kids on the block, but a little bit over 40 years old. A little bit about the Art Deco Society before I introduce our speaker. The Art Deco Society was founded to preserve, to protect, and to educate the public about New York's great Art Deco heritage and history. And we do a variety of programs throughout the year to celebrate New York during the Jazz Age and Art Deco around the world. We offer walking tours. We offer curated visits to museums. We go behind the scenes to archives of libraries and universities. We offer an immersive Autumn in New York weekend, 3 or 4 days of really seeing New York and all the boroughs in wonderful Art Deco splendor, and dine in great Jazz Age restaurants and cocktails in wonderful settings. We also travel to other Art Deco cities around the world as part of our Destination Deco program. Next month, we're going to Texas to see splendid Art Deco built by the oil boom of the 1920s and 30s in Austin and San Antonio, and we have 2 spots left for that if anyone is interested. And you can find out much more about us. We left some material on your seats, a copy of one of our journals, and other information about our upcoming programs. So now let me introduce tonight's speaker, who is also the Vice President of the Art Deco Society of New York. And even though he doesn't like to say he was one of the founding members because it places him in a different age group than he'd like to be, he's been around for a long time. Tony is an architectural historian, and he was honored in 2017 by the Guides Association of New York for his decades of leading great Art Deco tours of the city, not only its Art Deco history, but also the history of the city and its architecture. He also lectures in the United States and abroad on similar topics, and is the author of 5 books. His most recent was the award-winning New York Art Deco A Guide to Gotham's Jazz Age Architecture. And so, Tony, it's all yours for the evening. Thank you all so much.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Roberta, and thank you all for coming out. This is the first live talk I've given since COVID, and that's curious to me because the last one I gave was right before COVID, also in this room, and that's 4 years ago. It's been too long, and it's about time that we've all come out of our shells, and I'm glad to see you all. That's going backward. There we go. So I don't think that Art Deco is a phrase that really needs a lot of explanation to people in this room or really anywhere else. It's really become everybody's favorite architectural style. But it wasn't always that way. When we look at things like the skyline of Midtown Manhattan, it's impossible to imagine without the great Art Deco towers. Now, this photo was taken when there wasn't much competition. Nevertheless, there on the left is the originally RCA, then the General Electric building. Next to that is the great Art Deco hotel, the Waldorf-Astoria. Towering above it to the right is the Chrysler Building. Next to that is the Channon Building. Really, this period gave Midtown its first skyline, not the city, that downtown had an earlier one, but really in Midtown, these are the buildings that did it. And also, Art Deco just gave us so much just physical beauty to enjoy. The outside of buildings with mosaics, with enameled ironwork, that enormous roundel with the two people, what's she doing? She's got cymbals in her hand. It's on Radio City Music Hall. It's telling us what the building's about. Something that happens with the ornament on Art Deco buildings a lot. The one on the far left at the top is the Fish Building on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. The one below that is the only Art Deco apartment house that I know of in Staten Island, and it looks like it got lost on the way to the Bronx. And so it goes, but that's only on the outside. The inside, too, is just as gorgeous with metalwork, with beautiful floors like the Bronx apartment house. That is, in fact, the Fish Building apartment house lobby in the upper left-hand corner, or the mural in the center top of the Marine Air Terminal out in Queens. And it's just endless. And Art Deco had begun to be discovered in the 70s already. It was showing up in the galleries. There's one from the left in 1978 from Christie's, and the one on the right, 79 at Sotheby Park Bernay. So it was already happening, but it took a while to sort of catch fire. It has since caught fire. There are 8 books, not about Art Deco, not about Art Deco architecture, but about Art Deco architecture in New York City. Just extraordinary. That tells you something about the way that interest in it has grown. And Art Deco is the only architectural style I know of that regularly appears in the New York Times crossword puzzle. If you look down the left side, go halfway down to the first horizontal bar, right above it, you will see Art Deco. You'll also find Erte, he's often there. I think I saw Bauhaus once. I've never seen Gothic. This just tells you that, oh yes, everybody knows what Art Deco is. We can put it in. That wasn't always true. It was certainly well known in, the name didn't exist yet, but back in 1925, this is a phenomenon of the 20s and also the 30s. The name, as I think everybody here probably knows, but for those who don't, goes back to a very influential exposition that was held in Paris with a very long French name, which translates as the International Exposition of Modern Industrial and Decorative Arts. There's a poster on the, which? One of those is a poster, one is a catalog. It was held in Paris. That's the, for those of you who know Paris or have seen pictures, that's the Alexander III Bridge. That very large building at the top center is the Grand Palais, which was built, I think, in 1900 for a different exposition. So in other words, this part of town was a good place to have expositions. The one that happened in 1925 was enormous. It's on both sides of the Seine. And countries from all over the world participated. If you look at the, let's see, the right hand above the center piece, you'll see Mexico, you'll see Australia, you'll see Haiti, it goes on and on. What you won't see is the United States, because we did not send an envoy. We didn't have a pavilion. Somebody in the US decided that, well, we don't do modern in America, which I think is just fascinating. Modern is whatever you're doing right now. But that didn't stop Americans from going. And in fact, there were so many Americans, architects, painters, sculptors, but just people running around Paris to see this exhibit that Paris was called by some New York on the Seine. And a number of architects, when the show was over, brought things back here and put on exhibit. So it was extraordinarily influential. It wasn't just, well, here's the Swedish pavilion. That is just wonderful. But it was also stores. This is the Bon Marché department store had its very own exhibit. All right, so that was in the 1920s. In the 1930s, it was still happening. Then comes the Depression, then comes the war, Second World War, and people begin to forget. And, architecture is about many things, but it's also about fashion, and fashions change. And Art Deco fell by the wayside as the international style came in, or what we now call mid-century modernism. And Art Deco kind of got forgotten. And then it was rediscovered, and another exhibition. It's interesting, this is a style whose history is tied up with exhibitions, first the one in 1925, and then one in 1966, which was held at the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris. It's in the same complex that has the Louvre. It's just a much, much smaller museum. If you should find yourself at the Louvre, make a point of finding the doorway that takes you into this small museum. They still have wonderful Art Deco things on display. And they put on this show, which they called Les Années, 25. I imagine that's supposed to be said in French. I can't do that. And you'll notice they looked at a lot of things. They looked at the Bauhaus, that's Germany, style, that's Holland. And then they looked back at that show with the very, very long French name, which I think, just my theory, was too long to put on the posters and the catalog. So they shortened it just to Art Décoratif, which is just decorative arts in French. And maybe that was too long as well. So voila, Art Deco, the expression, was born. Now, it was noticed in many places, this exposition, certainly in Paris. So there's an article about it in the French newspaper Le Monde, which from March 11th, 1966, the show was already up. But the prior fall, the Italian edition of Vogue did a piece about what was coming, exhibits to watch for next year. And this is one they picked out. And this is the earliest mention of the phrase Art Deco that I've been able to find anywhere. You'll see that if you look down at the lower left-hand corner, at the very bottom, it says La Moda del Art Deco, the style of Art Deco. And then if you don't know what that is, we'll give you an explanation, the years from 1920 to 1930. And there's a design in the middle by Erte. It says, the text reads, a design by Erte for the cover of a fashion magazine from 1925. And it says the head of the woman is very geometricized, as is a butterfly earring that she's wearing. And then from the same period, it's talking about what's on the right, by Delate, there is a lamp with the recognizable elements, floral elements, frozen in geometric lines, which I think is a lovely definition of Art Deco style. So there it is. There we go. And then the Herald Tribune news service. The Herald, some of you may remember in the old days in Europe, if you wanted to get an American paper, the International Herald Tribune is the one to get. It sort of takes from the Times and other places. So they had a news service, which I think serviced in a number of newspapers, and they picked it up on March 28th of 66, and look at the title, Roaring Twenties Hits Paris. What a concept. Paris is going through a Roaring Twenties phase right now. It started recently with the opening of that retrospective. And then in 1968, we get the first book on the subject, written by Bevis Hillier. Bevis Hillier was an arts writer for the Times of London. He was in his 20s at the time, very young man. He was later the editor of the Connoisseur magazine, if anyone remembers the old Connoisseur magazine. And he wrote his book on Art Deco, and he was the first to do it. So that's all going on in the 60s. Well, but that's all on the other side of the Atlantic. What's happening here? Well, in New York, in the early 1960s, we're about to lose one of our finest monuments of architecture, the original Penn Station, which you see there. And every time I look at it, I think anytime anyone looks at it and you say, oh yes, we threw that one out, you have to wonder. But sadly we did, and it was an extraordinary structure. Look at the people, the size of the people, to get a sense of the size of that space, 7 acres of marble. It was one of the finest civic buildings that New York had ever had. It lasted 50 years. There was the interior. There's a new interior that's trying to reflect some of this grandeur. It's not bad, but it'll never be this. And actually, the proposed demolition was protested by architects. That's Philip Johnson there, about 2/3 of the way across. And I think the New York Times art critic is there as well, and a number of other architects. But down it came. And as I say, look at the picture on the right. We did throw it out. The sculpture, like that angel and a lot of other things, were taken over to New Jersey and thrown into the Meadowlands to help build foundations for what was built there later. And this is what went up in its place. And this is this wonderful cartoon from Roz Chast, how the old Penn Station got demolished. I have an idea. Let's tear down one of the most beautiful structures in New York and replace it with something really crappy. It'll take time and cost a fortune, but it'll be worth it. And that is, the desire for preservation had been going on. There was a preservation movement that went back 100 years in New York, but this is when things really got serious. If that can come down, what won't come down? And so in 1965, Mayor Wagner, who you see there, signed New York's landmarks law. By the way, there was no press in the room at the time. The only reason we have this photograph is because the legendary Margot Gale, who was very active in the Victorian Society and later founded the Friends of Cast Iron Architecture, and at whose feet I learned how to give walking tours of New York, had been involved with newspapers. I'm not entirely sure in what capacity, but she had a funny little camera. You know, you couldn't just take out your phone and take a picture. It was a different time. You needed a camera, but she had one. She saw this was happening, and she said, "I've got to get this." And she snapped the photograph, and that's why we have it. And well, what about Art Deco landmarks? There really aren't many at the very early years. This is the first one. These are the Rainey Memorial Gates. Paul Manship was the sculptor. Charles A. Platt was the architect behind it. These are at the Bronx Zoo. As you follow Fordham Road into Bronx Park and turn right, you will find these. And it's just an extraordinary set of gates in memory of Paul, what was his name? I've forgotten now. Mr. Rainey, his sister put them on. Grace Rainey Rogers, who's also got an auditorium at the Metropolitan Museum. It's the same family, put these up. And the Landmarks Commission always puts out a little report. They used to be little, now they're quite large, when it designates new landmarks. And in this case, they referenced the show. They didn't call it Art Deco. They didn't have that phrase yet. But they called it, quote, influenced by the French Exposition des Arts Décoratifs, which is certainly correct. All right, 1967, New Yorkers are beginning to get interested in architecture. Now, there have always been some people interested in architecture in New York, certainly architects, but as something for everybody, people taking walking tours, buying books, this was something fairly new. And one of the first, I believe, classic guidebook to New York architecture was the American Institute of Architects guidebook, the AIA Guide to New York, which I think is now either its 5th or its 6th edition. I can't keep track. They come out every 5 or 10 years. This is from the very first, this is not the 0th edition. The 0th edition was an early version that was put together by the authors of this, Elliot Walensky and Norval White, for a convention. The AIA had conventions always in a different city, and they'd put together some stapled papers with buildings you should see while you're here. And they did a big one for New York, and then somebody said, hey, that would make a great book. And so out this came. And it included a list of the various styles available in New York architecture. It's an interesting list. Colonial, okay, not too much, but there's some. Georgian/Federal, Greek Revival, Italianate, Gothic Revival, Classic Revival, Renaissance Revival, Romanesque Revival. You probably noticed the word revival showing up an awful lot. And then at the bottom, modern. And they each have a little icon. What's the icon for modern? Anyone recognize that? Yeah, it's Lever House, which is not Art Deco, but that's all they had. And they barely mention, here's the Chrysler Building write-up in this book. Tallest in the world, okay. One of the first uses of stainless steel, that's lovely. Okay, the lobby is a modernistic composition of African marble and chrome steel. Not an incorrect statement, but the phrase Art Deco isn't here yet. Now, the second edition is, 12 years later, 1978, that has changed. Look at that same list of symbols. They're all, the revivals are all there, but then at the bottom right, modern/Art Deco/Art Moderne. They've noticed. And there's a little, if you look up at the top, we're now including such phrases as Art Deco, and in the parenthesis, cubistic modern ornament inspired by the Paris Exposition, well, they got the date wrong, of 1924. Art Moderne inspired by the exhibition of 1937, and then the Bauhaus International style. It's still all tucked into one icon, but at least we're noticing that, yes, there are different kinds of modernism going on in New York. And same write-up for the Chrysler Building, but now the lobby is no longer a modernistic composition of African marble and chrome steel. It is an Art Deco. composition of African marble and chrome steel. So Art Deco is suddenly on everybody's lips. I don't know about everybody, but certainly anybody who had a copy of the AIE guide. Now, in between those two editions, what happened? There were two more exhibits, both in New York City at Finch College. I don't know how many of you remember Finch College. It was an avant-garde college for young women, avant-garde arts college for young women, I think, with a very avant-garde faculty and a gallery with an avant-garde curator named Elaine Varian. And in 1970, she's just 2 years after Bevis Hillier's book in London, she put on a show, not of architecture first, of objects. She did architecture a couple of years later. And there's Elaine Varian. She's long gone, I'm sorry to say, but there she is at Finch College. In this photo in 1972, she happens to be with sculptor Saul LeWitt, who recently passed away. He had nothing to do with Art Deco. That's the only photo of her I could come up with. And then Bevis Hillier came over to New York, had lunch with Elaine Varian, at least that's the story I've heard, and together they went out to Minneapolis to the Institute of Arts, and they put on a big show called The World of Art Deco. And there you see the cover on the right, and on the left, this is from the introduction. This is Elaine Varian speaking. We met on his first trip to the United States, discussed our mutual interest in the art of the 20s and 30s, and found we had selected the same objects from several collections. What she had to do was go to collections. Who were the big collectors early on? Well, two of the ones that you would recognize were Barbara Streisand and Andy Warhol. But she also found an industrial designer whose name I can never remember, who designed one of the streamlined turnstiles in the New York subway. She found him and borrowed stuff from him. And that's what they had to do. They really had to scramble because this was still so new in people's minds. Now, there were changing views about Art Deco, even just before this show. So here's Wolf von Eckhart. He was the architectural critic of the Washington Post in 1969. Quote, everything from earrings and posters to the great movie palaces and ocean liners of the 20s and 30s was jubilantly Art Deco. It was almost as in the Middle Ages where everything from handwriting to the cathedrals was Gothic. And that's about right. And then, more interesting to me, Teresa Hooks from the Daily Defender, which I believe was a newspaper for the garment district. This season in the fashion capital, all of the pace-setting designers are referring to the term Art Deco. And then she asked somebody what Deco exactly was, and the person answered, do you ever get a nostalgic type feeling, even if you don't go back that far? Well, baby, that's Art Deco. And that's interesting because a lot of people saw this not as connoisseurship, but as nostalgia. And the show itself was interesting. There it is again. We arrive in the Times. When Andy Warhol, Roy Lichtenstein, Barbara Streisand, Donald Judd the sculptor, and others began acquiring the objects they have lent to this show, it was not books, but nostalgia that inspired them. Most current collectors of Art Deco were born between the wars when the style was young. And there's Douglas Davis in Newsweek, 1970 also. Most Art Deco is in fact sociology rather than art. I think we might argue with that, but this is what he's talking about. The magic years between the wars, the so-called Jazz Age. It's really nostalgia for this period that has brought Art Deco back. And there's probably something to that. But it also accounted for some people who thought that it was just awful. This is John Cannaday, an older man at the time as a critic, and he wrote his review. He called his review Phony Art from the 20s. And he wrote, the subject is Art Deco. Most of us who were subjected to it would be glad to forget it, but it fascinates a generation of youngsters born during the 1940s, after the dreadful business was over. Bevis Hillier belongs to this post-Deco generation, and then he recommends the catalog heartily to any masochist whose memory goes back far enough. So there was definitely, there were some mixed feelings about this. All right, 1974-75, we get two new books on New York City Art Deco architecture. Don Black's, I think, was first in 1920 to 1940. The more scholarly one, I believe, was Skyscraper Style by, Servan Robinson, who did these wonderful photographs in the book, and Rosemary Hogg-Bletter, who was a professor at the time at Columbia. And these books were everywhere at that time. Suddenly everyone was, look what we have. We didn't know. Let's go out and find it. Finch College then came back with its next show, and this time it was on architecture, selected with text by Elaine Varian. This was in 1974 to 75. And it got a very different reception than the first one, which was just the objects. Here's Ada Louise Huxtable, the New York Times architecture critic. This is in 74, quote, no style has been more neglected, undervalued, misunderstood, or camped up. No style has been more vulnerable to the bulldozer, egregious remodeling, or the disdain of contemporary scholars, not to mention fellow art critics at their newspaper. The appeal of this vintage modernism, naive, romantic, and upbeat, is enormous. But I believe, this is still Ada Louise Huxtable speaking, but I believe with Mrs. Varian that Art Deco is to be taken seriously. The buildings shown represent the last great period of decorative art. I think that's right on target. So, 1974, the Landmarks Commission, where I have to acknowledge I worked there for 20 years in the late 20th century, but not at this time. The second landmark was 1974, the American Radiator Building, Raymond Hood, which is really more of a transitional building. If you look at the details on the right, it looks almost Gothic until you look really closely and you see that, no, actually it's a very modernistic take on Gothic. But this was the second Art Deco building to become a city landmark in '74. The commission was now 9 years old. It took 9 years to get to protect well, only one building really, one building and one set of gates. The report, again, they always issue a report, talked about the bold cubic massing of forms, often associated with the Art Deco style. Okay, the first time around they just talked about Paris. This time, okay, it's the Art Deco style, as if we all know what that is. I'm not sure that we all did at the time, but they certainly did. Now, there's a generation gap going on here. Here's a 1975 book review by David Gebhardt. Art Deco is so near that many living today knew it and experienced it when it was new, making it difficult for them to see it as a significant episode, especially since many of them were raised to despise the sordid creature that wandered from the true path of the modern, that is the international style. And I think that would be John Cannaday for sure. 1978, we got our first major loss of a building that really should not have been allowed to be lost. This is the airlines terminal. It's at the southwest corner of Park Avenue and East 42nd Street, just opposite Grand Central. John Peterkin was a British architect who did a lot of interesting Art Moderne buildings. This is a postcard. This is an early shot, 1941. This is where you went to get the bus to the airport, basically, or you could check in. The airlines had ticket counters. This is where you walk in. Look at just the lettering. American Airlines, Eastern, that's Art Deco lettering. And the wonderful image of the world, right, with the continents floating above your head. And I think we've got is that a whale spouting over there on the left and so on? Just a, this is a business building. It's about getting people to the airport. But in this period, that's not enough. You have to show who you are in your design, and this does it in spades. You walked in, you immediately hit these escalators, so you went up the escalators and you found this extraordinary room with everything, with images, with the sweeping curves, with the Art Deco fonts, not to mention the great fountain. I think it's a fountain in the center. It certainly looks like one. And this is where you get your limousine to the airport. It was just spectacular. I wish I'd been there before it was torn down. I never got there. It's been replaced by this, the Philip Morris Building, 1979. But when the Times had an article about this building replacing the old one, it at least called the airlines terminal Art Deco. The Eagles were rescued, and they were moved to a Bank of America building in Richmond, Virginia. I don't know if they're still there. I hope they are. Wonderful pieces of sculpture. All right, 1978, we get two big landmark battles. Radio City Music Hall and the Chrysler Building lobby. And if anybody were to suggest today that somebody wants to destroy Radio City Music Hall or redesign the Chrysler Building lobby, you just get a, what are you talking about? But in 1978, it was still a realistic possibility. We hadn't quite gotten to this point yet. Now, the city was a very different place in the 1970s. Those of you who were here remember it. It was a dangerous place. Times Square, which is just a few blocks from Radio City Music Hall, looked like this. It was full of crime, prostitution, drug running, and people were scared. People who might have bought tickets, that is to say, to Radio City Music Hall, were scared and weren't sure they wanted to go down to Midtown in the evening. And what's more, there was competition. You got all of these new cinemas going up in the suburbs, or you could have a television in your own living room, and who has to go outside and actually deal with the city or people or anything nasty like that? Well, we can just watch TV and pretend the rest of the world is somewhere else, which actually it was. So Radio City set to close. Well, that got a lot of attention. Not at first because of Art Deco, but because it was Radio City. Going to those holiday shows was just something that everybody had heard of, whether you'd been or not. It was just part of part of what you heard about New York. So there's a whole list of headlines: Radio City set to close, let's save the music hall for all of us, weighing Radio City's fate, suggestions sought in preservation campaign. Oh, maybe this is a landmark issue. Yes, landmarks unit, bottom left-hand corner, landmarks unit will mull the music hall. Even as there's the original announcement, Newsday 1976, Radio City says it faces a final curtain. Actually, it was a number of Rockettes who organized to attract attention. There they are, kicking up their legs in their winter coats. Keep the Rockettes and keep in Radio City. And in January 25th, 1978, quote, this is from Newsday, the Landmarks Preservation Commission voted unanimously yesterday to hold a public hearing, March 14th, on Radio City Music Hall as a city landmark, an Art Deco masterpiece. In other words, not just Radio City Music Hall, it's not just the Christmas show, it's the building itself. And the Show People's Committee over here, which I believe the Rockettes founded, had this wonderful image on it, just nice. And Grace Gluck, in the Another Times Critic, wrote, the city will push for landmark status for the plush interior of the building, long recognized as a monument of the Art Deco design that held sway in the 1930s. I don't know how long it had been recognized, by 1978, but people were certainly talking about it. And then Henry Geldzahler wrote, it's the theater that God would have built if he had the money. Do with that what you like. 2 weeks later, it was designated, Radio City was, and the Landmarks Report is now not just saying, oh, it's from the 1925 Paris Exposition, or, oh, it's a nice piece of Art Deco architecture. Oh, no, no, no. As one of the finest theater spaces in the United States, and as one of the principal achievements of the Art Deco style, the interior of Radio City is of a unique importance to the history of American architecture and design. Yeah, I think it is. Now, this was also a time when the city was not doing well. The city had applied not for money, but just for loan guarantees to Washington, D.C., and President Ford and the Congress declined. And the Daily News came up with its classic headline, Ford to City, drop dead. That is very Daily News. And so we were not doing well economically. The city was teetering on bankruptcy. So here's the Chrysler Building, this is from a New York Times article of March 12, 1978. As Edward Gordon, real estate person, was strode through the lobby, he pointed his finger at the crack that ran all the way across the glass covering the directory on the wall. Look at that, he said. What is this place, a loft building on 23rd Street? Of course, a loft building on 23rd Street right now is a nice catch, but back then it wasn't yet. And then here's Paul Goldberger that same year. For a long time, the Chrysler Building, the city's masterpiece of Art Deco. I mean, these superlatives are just going up and up and up. And one of the most famous skyscrapers was run like a piece of broken down real estate. So the same day that the commission had a public hearing on Radio City Music Hall, oh yeah, let's throw the Chrysler Building and its lobby in as well. And the commission wrote, the Chrysler Building, a stunning statement in the Art Deco style, embodies the romantic essence of the New York City skyscraper. Yeah, it sure does. So things are looking up. In March, the Massachusetts Life Insurance Company bought the building. They announced a $23 million facelift. The Times reported that restoration would include cleaning, repairing the marble, its murals, refurbishing the elevators, and renovating the Cloud Club. Well, the lobby did get refurbished, and that became a landmark. The Cloud Club couldn't be a landmark because it wasn't a public space. That's part of the law that says you can't have an interior landmark that's not a public space. So we'll come to that in a minute. Eventually, the lobby was restored. That's the extraordinary mural on the ceiling. It's actually showing the construction of the building. And those men you see there those are portraits of the workmen who built the building. And that's so typical of this period. So this was the Cloud Club. Deco pics. These are pictures by Randy Juster, by the way. If you love looking at Art Deco pictures, go to his website, decopics, spelled pix.com. They're spectacular. He did a whole thing on the Cloud Club while he still could get into it. I think it was finally trashed after 1980, I think. Don't remember the exact date. So that's the before picture, and that's the after picture. Couldn't stop that from happening. A real shame. All right, but more landmarks follow. 1978, we get the Channon Building, catty corner from the Chrysler Building. Actually, the earliest of the Deco skyscrapers. Well, I guess not. It's a little bit. What is it? 70. It's about a year or two after the American Radiator Building, but it's pure Art Deco. It's not transitional the way that building is. 1979, we get the McGraw-Hill Building, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. 1980, we get the the Marine Air Terminal out at LaGuardia. And you know, that symbolism of what the building is for, look at that lovely tile going around the curve at the top. What is that? That's a flying fish. The airplanes that took off from here were the original Pan Am Clippers. They were boat planes. They were on pontoons. So the flying fish are telling you what the building is for. Again, this is just so typical of the style. All right, and now we get the Art Deco Society of New York. Founded in 80 or 81, I forget the precise, we're not sure the precise date, because there's, when do you found it, when do you get your incorporation papers, you can fiddle with that. But there in the center, the woman in the center looking very happy is Barbara Barrett-Kapitman, who had come up from Miami, where she had created the Miami Design Preservation League to protect the fabulous collection of art, well, they're really modern, but what the heck, Art Deco hotels that make Miami Beach the extraordinary place that it is. And she was out to convince people in other cities that they too could do this, that you could form an Art Deco society. And so the Art Deco Society of New York was formed. Standing to, as you look at the picture to your right of her, is Bill Weber, who was an early president of the Art Deco Society. He worked for the Rambush Corporation. He was interested in it from a professional point of view. They did a lot of not just decorating, they didn't just design a lot of the early buildings, they then went back and did the restorations. And here's the letter that Barbara Kapitman sent to Bill. You guys have really pulled the whole thing off so wonderfully, it should hearten the other societies we're forming. Please offer my congratulations, and so forth and so on. And then what's this? Oh, this is a letter from Ed Koch, the mayor, to Bill Weber on October 6, 1981. Dear Mr. Weber, George Bernard Shaw wrote that art should, quote, refine our sense of character and conduct of justice and sympathy. In New York City, art accomplishes all that and more. The Art Deco Society of New York was established, this is obviously verbiage that they picked up from the Art Deco Society, established to help identify, preserve, and arouse interest in the great Art Deco heritage of New York. I wish you every success in this endeavor and welcome the Art Deco newsletter, which is where this was printed, to the city's roster of important cultural material. All right, 1981, we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Waldorf-Astoria, which had just been redecorated. It had been turned, somebody had decided in the 60s that the Art Deco was fusty, let's make it look, Edwardian, whatever that turns out to mean. And then they said, oh wait, Art Deco is back. And in 1981, on its 50th anniversary, they had, or by the time of its 50th anniversary, they had done an Art Deco restoration. And the Art Deco Society, we were very new, put on three talks, and I think we had a cake, and I think there were some people playing music. That figure, okay, so far on the far left, that's Bill Weber again. Standing next to him is a much younger version of your speaker. Next to him was May Stone, who was a historian of hotels. Next to her was David Morton, the senior editor of Progressive Architecture, and next to him was Larry Zim, who was an interior designer. He was also later the president of the Art Deco Society. So it's over 40 years ago. Then we began with our tours, exploring Art Deco. This is June of 1982. A tour of 15 Midtown buildings, each with elements of Art Deco styling, will be conducted by the Art Deco Society. We got crowds. There's never been a tour of Art Deco buildings, but there have been lots of other tours. Walking tours in New York looking at architecture go back to the 1950s, New York Museum of the City of New York. But Art Deco buildings, that was new. We did two sets. We did a set of 4 tours in the spring and again in the fall, and they're always selling out. People were fascinated by the stuff. Okay, back to the landmarks, 1981, we do the Park Plaza Apartments, what I think is the first Art Deco apartment house to be built in the Bronx. 1981 also, the Empire State Building. You mean the Empire State Building? What is this? 16 years after the commission is founded, they got around to the Empire State Building. It was its 50th anniversary. It seemed like a nice hook. The owners were amenable, so it did happen. Oops. There we go. And that same year, the Daily News Building, Raymond Hood's masterpiece, with its lobby, together with its lobby. Kurtz Brothers department store in Jamaica. Art Deco is all over the city. Yes, the skyscrapers are mostly in Midtown and some are downtown, but this style spread to every other building type: apartment houses, diners, movie theaters, department stores, airline terminals, bus terminals, you name it. And so the commission found this department store in downtown Jamaica, and it became a landmark. It's a short building. Look at the window that you see there on the right, the row of windows going up. It actually looks like a skyscraper. The style somehow suggests skyscraper, even in small, not tall buildings. Now, there were still some losses. The biggest one, I think, at this time, 1981, was Bonwit-Teller, which had originally been built as the Stewart and Company. So on the right is an old flyer showing it when it was Stewart and Company. The modern woman loves shopping in little individual shops. She loves the feeling, the atmosphere which surrounds her there. And so we have created shops like that. Was apparently what the store did. They also designed a gorgeous building. This is the original entrance. It's close up on the right. And it's hard to see all of the detail. It's extremely busy, but it must have been just terrific. When Bonwit-Teller took it over, they, I'm afraid, they took that down. They put up their own, but it's still largely Art Deco in style. And this was a terrific building. Unfortunately, it was in the path of development. And I think it was the Municipal Art Society got involved in talking to the developer. Couldn't we at least save some of the ornament? And there were these two reliefs. You see a close-up of it on the right. These are released by René Chambellin, who was one of the great ornamental designers of the day. Every architect wanted him to do their building. And so an agreement was struck with the developer to carefully take these down and donate them to the Metropolitan Museum. Well, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum, you will not find them, because something happened, and instead of being taken down, they were thrown down and smashed to bits. I will not tell you who the developer was. I will, however, show you the building that replaced it. Moving right along. So 1982, the Film Center building, a wonderful interior way over on 9th Avenue. This was a building where people sent, those old canisters of, that movie films used to come in. Those would be going out and coming back every day. That's who was in the building. So it was a modest, it wasn't a skyscraper, not the Chrysler Building, but Élie Jacques Kahn, the architect, loved doing buildings like this, and he always gave them all. And he did this extraordinary interior, and this became a landmark in 1982. In 1983, the Sophia Brothers. Now, that building was actually built as an automatic parking garage. And the banks who financed it were so dubious about this whole thing. They said, okay, please design it in such a way that it can be converted to something else if this fails. Because it had to do with a parking machine that would grab your car by the axle and then pull it to its parking spot. I shudder to think what that was like, because it got turned into a warehouse almost immediately. But by 1983, it had become an apartment house, and it was brought to the attention of the commission, and the commissioners voted to designate it. It was not a unanimous vote. The then chairman of the agency, whom I respect enormously, but this is a matter of opinion, said, that's a landmark? But the vote went, and he said, well, that's democracy. And the building is, it's a modest apartment, it's a modest building, but it's the only former automatic parking garage in the Deco style that I can name. So I suppose it's worth doing. All right, the Art Deco Society is getting active. In 1984, we've got an Art Deco week. Never mind Art Deco Day, we're doing Art Deco week, a week of tours and events, and we still do this every year. We have it generally in the fall. We have a program of 3 or 4 days just devoted to Art Deco events in New York. People come from all over the world for it, as well as from in the city. Autumn in New York, we call it. It's very popular. And here's this cartoon from the New Yorker. Look at it's a Hamilton cartoon, and it's a fashionable couple in a gallery. Look at the caption. Do you realize we are living through the second time people got tired of Art Deco? And the joke is that appeared in 1984. Which I believe is 40 years ago. So apparently we're still getting tired of it. 1985, they just start to pile up. These are all the landmarks. In April, you get Rockefeller Center. In May, the Regiment Armory in Harlem, fabulous building. July, the GE building at Lexington and 51st, 4 of the Twin Tower Deco apartment houses, Century, Majestic, Eldorado, all on Central Park West, and the Normandy on Riverside Drive. There they are. These were both built for Irwin Channon. Channon, who was a developer who became an architect as well, spent a month at Paris at the 1925 exposition. And he was later quoted in the Times as saying something along the lines of, France is of course the motherland of the arts, but I think we can do a better job of it here in New York. So this is how New Yorkers operate, right? And these are his 2 buildings, the Century and the Majestic. There was a landmarks hearing, and the Art Deco Society was there testifying, because this is something that we do. Walter Taylor, whom I don't remember, but he must have been a member of the Art Deco Society of New York, linked the Century, the Majestic, and the Eldorado as distinguished examples of the Art Deco style. Whereas most apartment buildings built since are monotonous slabs, he said, remember this is the 1980s, These are exciting compositions of twin towers, setbacks, cantilevers, vertical and horizontal ribbons, colored masonry, and terracotta ornament. True enough. But there was a generation gap going on. This is the staff of the Landmarks Commission in the mid-1980s, and with one or two exceptions, we're all in our 30s, maybe late 20s. Yes, if you go all the way up to the top, second from the far left, that's your speaker again. So we were a young crowd, and we were interested in this newfangled Art Deco stuff. The commissioners tended to be older. They were often retired people who had succeeded well enough in life that they could take off an entire Tuesday to attend a hearing and be unpaid, because the commissioners are not paid except for the chairman who actually runs the agency. So when these buildings came up, it wasn't a slam dunk. And I recall one of the commissioners saying, "You mean to tell me that there are unprotected federal houses in the city and you're bringing us these 1930s apartment houses? How can those be landmarks? I'm older than those buildings." Staff wasn't, but they got designated. Now that takes us into the 21st century. In 2005, as the Chrysler Building celebrated its 75th birthday, the Art Deco Society celebrated its 25th, and we hosted the 8th World Congress on Art Deco. These happen every other year. They alternate between a city in North America or a city someplace else in the world. Next year is 2025. That happens to be the 100th anniversary of the Paris Exposition from which Art Deco takes its name. So it's still in the planning works, but that apparently is where the next Art Deco Congress is going to be. Makes perfect sense. And in 2011, we got New York's first Art Deco Historic District, a slab of the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. The Grand Concourse is not lined with Art Deco apartment buildings. The main development happened in the 20s, and Art Deco sort of filled in the gaps, but it's where everybody's eye goes when you go to visit them, because they're by far the most interesting buildings on the street. And then major restoration work. The Chrysler Building has now been restored more than once, and including this lighting. Jack Kent Cook, who was a baseball team owner, I think, or some sports team owner of some kind, I forget the details, thought it would be nice to light up the Chrysler Building, because a lot of buildings in Midtown were getting lit up at night. So we sent a team up there only to discover that the fixtures were already in place. Apparently, or enough of them were already in place. Apparently the plan had been to do it, and then because of the Great Depression, it never happened. So this lit up for the first time in 1982, but that's the original plan for the lighting, which is really remarkable. The Ben Shahn murals at the Bronx Post Office have also been restored more than once. They're looking much better. The Marine Air Terminal building had a wonderful series of murals that were that were about the history of flight. And they were whitewashed over because somebody thought that there was something vaguely communist about them. Don't ask me to explain that, I can't. However, they found that they still existed. They've been restored and they've been returned. The earliest are about Icarus, flying too close to the sun and the wax in his wings. But the last of the most modern one, well, with 1939, is this group of people, calling in one of the seaplanes that you can see there up in the upper left-hand corner. The Empire State Building, even in 1981, when it became a landmark, we talked to the owners and said, what about that wonderful modernistic ceiling lobby that you've got? It's hidden by the acoustile and all the lamps. And have you thought about restoring it? And they said, nah, we're not going to do that. And they didn't. Until a few years ago. This is what they found under the acoustile. There was a wreck. It was beyond restoring. But this is Beyer Blinder Bell, one of the great firms that does this in New York, and they recreated the design. And they did a splendid job. We gave them an award a few years ago, because that's one of the things the Art Deco Society does. And this is what it looks like today, and it's just stunning. Now, we have lost some things. New York once had a lot of automats. Most of them are gone, including this spectacular one on 181st Street. That's the outside on the left, and on the right, the inside had this great ceiling with an image of the Empire State Building, a map of Manhattan, which you can just see the tip of, and also an image of the George Washington Bridge, which was completed that year. They made it and this is in Washington Heights, so the architect, Louis Allen Abramson, made that the motif of the design. It's just an automat, and yet he did a spectacular job. Sadly, this has been trashed. And so is this one that was on West 57th Street. Some of you may remember it. It went through several iterations. It was a bookstore. It was a Motown nightclub. Then it was a deli, and then it was vacant, and now it's gone. But this one on 104th Street still stands. This is what it looked like originally. This is what it looked like about 6 or 8 years ago. Kind of a mess, but still standing. And this is what it looks like today. And this is now something that will not be thrown out, whereas once upon a time, no one would have thought twice about throwing it out. The Waldorf-Astoria. The outside was a landmark way back when, but the interior was not. And when it was bought in 2016, we're talking 8 years ago now, this is still not reopened yet. COVID, I'm sure, had something to do with that. When it was bought by a Chinese company, the fear was that the interior spaces, which were not protected, might be in danger because they were going to convert some or all of it to condominium space. So, wonderful spaces like this. So our former executive director, Megan, I'm blanking on her last name because I'm getting old, got together with, oh, look at that, ballroom, got together with the Historic Districts Council, there they are, and they using modern social media that I'll never understand, suddenly they had 300 people show up on like the last day that the hotel was open, wandering through the halls, oohing and eyeing over everything. And then the Landmarks Commission held a public hearing and designated the 5 interiors. So whatever's going on behind that scaffolding, because it's still closed, those spaces are protected. And I think that's one of our big successes. I don't think we can take total credit for it. The Historic Districts Council played a big role. The Landmarks Commission did the work, but we were part of it. And that's one of the things that we do. And one of the things I'm happy that we do. So on Tuesday, the city's Landmarks Preservation Commission voted unanimously to landmark several sections of the hotel's interior to protect the building's most grand public spaces. It was really a gem. And this isn't, I'm not sure what, this isn't a photograph. It's some kind of rendering because the work isn't done yet. But this is what we're hoping the interiors are going to look like. This is 40 years after that 1981 event that we did for the 50th anniversary of the hotel. So we have history with this hotel. And these are some of the things I hope this is what it's going to look like, because this looks very good. And then there's the one we lost. The battle continues. The McGraw-Hill building had a lot, that's what we saw earlier. It was a landmark as of 1981, but not the lobby. This is the original lobby. It had been altered, and that's one of the reasons we couldn't make a case to the Landmarks Commission. No, we made the case, they didn't accept it. I'm sorry to say it looks like that today. But the building still stands, and it is a stunning structure. There's a picture from when it opened, and that extraordinary view of, this is a building with two facades. The facade that you see from the north or south looks, this is a transitional building, looks international style. It's horizontal windows, it lines up, you don't notice the setbacks. If you see it from the east or west, this is the view, probably the most famous view, it's a step back building, it's got Art Deco ornament, it's a wonderful color, it's green and blue industrial tiling. It's spectacular. The building is safe, but the view may not be, because when the Port Authority of New York has announced that it's going to build a development, when it's going to do a new bus terminal, which Lord knows we need, but it's going to be financed by putting up 2 enormous towers. And if you look closely, they're right next door to the McGraw-Hill building, and they block that view. So a number of historic preservation organizations have noticed this and are going to start making a fuss. We don't know what's going to happen. Clearly, the work continues. But our last slide, we have things to be grateful for. Whether you've been away from New York for a little bit or a long time, when you come back, if you fly back in, whether it's day or night, and you see the Chrysler Building, you know you're home. These are the buildings that just, even though they're 90 years old now, these are the buildings that gave so much to the identity of New York City. And now its style shows up in the crossword puzzle. Everybody knows and loves these buildings, and that's a good thing. Thank you so much.
Tony, that was tremendous. I mean, we really raced through 100 years of Art Deco history, didn't we? So thank you so much. That was just incredible. And
well, I for one am out of breath. So there you go.
Thank you. Thank you for keeping it under an hour. That was very, very kind of you. Anyway, it was fantastic. I'll say a few more words at the end, but I'm sure the audience will have some questions. And I also want to remind our online audience that if you would use the Q&A section, and our colleague Meg Stanton will forward those to me. And I see a hand over there. I'm going to start over here. So wait till the mic get here. No, because it's being recorded and the audience online will not be able to hear you.
Hi, I'm an architect, Lynn Funk, and I had a question for Tony. the American Radiator Building on Bryant Park with that gold coating on the stone. I haven't seen anything like that really in other exemplars, and I'm wondering if you could comment on that color and material.
Sure. One of the, we don't live in a black and white world. All buildings have color, but in New York, color is generally monotone and it's often gray. One of the big changes that the Art Deco movement brought was extraordinary color. And Raymond Hood, who's the designer of the American Radiator Building, did that in spades. His Daily News building is red and white and black stripes. The American Radiator Building is black and gold. The McGraw-Hill Building was bluish green. The black and gold, there are theories about this. The Radiator Building was for a radiator company. Their showroom was in the basement. And somebody suggested that Hood chose black and gold to suggest a glowing coal for heating. And he said that was nonsense. But who knows? It was such an unusual building in so many ways, but especially its color. Every night, when it was very well lit originally, I mean, it's still lit now, but it was very dramatically lit originally, and people would gather by the hundreds on the corner just to gawk at it because it was so unusual. So you're right, it's a very unusual color choice. And a very successful one, apparently.
Hi, thank you very much. That was incredible. Just a question about, you're talking about the Waldorf-Astoria and that you're hoping, what's inside looks at. What, if any, consequences are there for developers who violate landmark commission designations?
Oh, boy. You start with violations and you end with court cases. That's a subject for an hour's talk. There are those who think that the powers of the commission are not strong enough, and there are others who think that they're too strong. So they're probably just right. And generally, things have happened. Buildings have been, buildings that were supposed to become landmarks were mysteriously torn down at night. That's happened once or twice. It doesn't happen very often, I'm happy to say. So I'd like to think that the system is working reasonably well when it comes to that. That's the best I can tell you.
Right, some questions?
Thank you. You didn't refer to or show us any churches or other places of worship. The only one I'm familiar with is Church of the Heavenly Rest on Fifth Avenue, but are there others?
There certainly are. I guess I have to go back and put one in. One of the best is in Astoria, Queen, what is it called? The Church of the Holy, the Sacred. Thank you, the Church of the Precious Blood. It's an extraordinary building inside and out. It has been restored recently with a grant from the New York Landmarks Conservancy. That's a private nonprofit, not the Landmarks Commission. And it's looking really, really good. There are other churches like it, but they're fairly rare. It was in an architectural journal from 1931 to 32, I think. I came across an article that discussed this issue because that year they were showing off all, the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building, all these great new Art Deco buildings, and then the churches, including the new churches that were going up, neo-Gothic and neo-Romanesque. And the writer said, well, religion is a conservative institution, and churches tend to go with conservative styles, and I think that's accurate. But there are some exceptions. The Catholic Church had commissioned a number of churches in the late 20s, early 30s, like the Precious Blood, from a firm whose name I am blanking on. But they did, I think a dozen I can think of in the city, and then a few outside of it, and a few actually quite far away. And they were Art Deco or Art Moderne. There is now today it's a synagogue, but it was built as a Christian Science church in Washington Heights. And there are a few Christian Science Art Deco buildings across the country. This is the only one in New York. And curiously, they chose, it was 1931, so it's just after the Waldorf-Astoria went up, they chose a brick whose color was called Waldorf Gray. The Waldorf-Astoria stone building was going to be a fully stone building, but that was very expensive even for the Waldorf, so they decided to go with a gray brick for the upper stories. But there was no such thing as gray brick at the time. So they put out word that said, if anybody can come up, any foundry can come up with a gray brick, we've got a big order for you. And the Waldorf Gray was created. And this apparently caught the attention of the church, who said, that's the color we want for our new modernistic church. So there are some, there just aren't many. Temple Emmanuel has, well, it's a mishmash. It has some deco ornament and some deco details. It does. But there just aren't many. There are some, clearly. Yes.
Okay, just hold on one second. And I do encourage our online audience to submit some questions.
Hi, first of all, I really enjoyed your talk. That was fantastic, so thank you for that. So just have a follow-up question about the Waldorf-Astoria. Did you get a lot of pushback from the Chinese insurer in maintaining the interior? Was that sort of like this fight that your organization had that you won? And what should we, it sounds like it's been delayed, a lot of the renovation. What should we expect in the next few years? What do you think will be there and not be there?
Are you from TikTok?
Am I? No.
I really don't have much knowledge about that. I don't work at the Landmarks Commission anymore, so I don't know what their internal discussion was. I know that it was a big public outcry, that the building was already a landmark from years back, so it probably wasn't too hard a call. But that's a great question. I'm sorry, I just don't know. I know that the delay has been going, well, it's 8 years since they started and it's still not done. I imagine COVID might have had something to do with that. I think there was a change in ownership within China. That's something I'm sorry, I just don't know. I wish I could tell you more.
I was just thinking, Tony, that we would never be able to stamp you because your vast knowledge, but I suppose not even Tony Robbins can know every single thing about Art Deco. In the meantime, I have a few questions now from our online audience. This is from Katie. And what about the Rock Center, the indoor, outdoor, 13 buildings, campus, public, private? Do you have anything to say about that?
You have an hour to spend. I mean, it's a fabulous collection. It's when I first came back from graduate school in 1976, and when I discovered about the architecture, I didn't know that New York had architecture. It was a very different time. When I was in college, in my freshman year, that would be 1968, I had an art history class, Art 101, and it was unusual in that the professor included in his grand survey American architecture. We learned there were two kinds, colonial and modern. Things eventually did evolve, but we didn't have words for it. And I remember wandering around New York looking at buildings with a friend of mine, and I didn't know the phrase Art Deco yet. We called them 30s buildings. That's the best we could do. And I remember standing in front of Rockefeller Center and looking up and saying, I think these are 30s buildings, which they are. Rockefeller Center is a landmark. It was designated in the, I think, the late 80s. It is the great urbane center of New York. It's so interesting that the plaza of Rockefeller Center is the public square, in a way, of New York, and it's privately owned, which tells us something interesting about New York. There were 3 architectural firms who worked on it. Raymond Hood was of the Daily News building and the McGraw-Hill building, was a chief designer until he died unexpectedly very young. He was in his 50s in 1934, but he was there for the original part, working with 2 other firms. But they signed everything, the Associated Architects, so we're not entirely sure who designed what. It was particularly important for the extraordinary collection of artists that they brought in to work on it. Really, you have to stop me now, because I'll just go on forever. It's a huge story. There are 3 or 4 books that I could recommend. You probably know about them. Yes, it is one of the great Art Deco complex. It is the great single Art Deco complex in New York, without question.
Another online question. This is from Tom Ryan. Does the Art Deco Society actively search for and survey Art Deco buildings that are candidates for landmark designation?
We actively survey for Art Deco buildings. We have, if you go to our website, artdeco.org, which tells you that we got our website address back when nobody cared about Art Deco, so that was available. You will find the Art Deco map, registry and map, and I think we're up to about it's either 600 or 800 buildings right now, and we're constantly adding to it. When we hear about buildings that are endangered, we have a preservation committee that tries to figure out what to do. And we approach the Landmarks Commission with suggestions for designation, and occasionally we get involved in write-in campaigns. So we're one of a number of preservation organizations in New York that do that sort of thing, but we're the one that focuses really on Art Deco. So I guess that's the answer.
Right. I do have some more online questions, but let me see, is there anyone in the audience? Okay, excuse me. Okay, while I'm walking up, why don't I ask another question? Many Emery Roth buildings are described as Art Deco. Thoughts?
Many are Emery Roth. Well, yeah, no, they're not. The closest thing would be the Look Building. That's on Madison Avenue, right, just a block north of St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is 1948, and it's Emery Roth. I think it's still Emery Roth Senior. And that's sort of, it's sort of halfway between still, the modernistic and the newly born international style. But Emery Roth himself didn't design Art Deco buildings, and yet his firm did. And the Normandy would be one example. There are a couple on Central Park West. He was interviewed in the press, and he said, I like old Italian architecture, so that's what I do. And I couldn't understand how he had a couple of Art Deco buildings, and then I met his grandson, who told me that it was his father, I think it was Richard, who liked Art Deco. And so when Richard, the son, got a chance to do a building, that's where the Art Deco came from. So it's not Emery Roth per se, but it is his son. And there are a few, and such as the few that there are actually quite fine, because that firm always did wonderful work until they started doing the office buildings that are basically known for encompassing the largest amount of space for the cheapest dollar.
Tony, great presentation. My name is Daniel Sago, real estate developer, Art Deco enthusiast. Question for you. One of my favorite buildings is just 2 blocks south of here, 500 Fifth Avenue. Why do you think that building is great, and why doesn't it get the love it deserves?
It's probably overshadowed by its older brother, the Empire State Building, same architects. It's interesting. It's the firm that William Lamb, who was the, is it William Lamb? Yes, I think so, of Shreve Lamb and Harmon, who was the architect of the Empire State Building, didn't like Art Deco. Yes, the Empire State Building has Art Deco characteristics. There's no getting around it. He couldn't help himself. He was in, that's what people were doing, but he didn't like it. I met his widow and interviewed her 40 years ago, and she told me that he really hated what we now call Art Deco. He used to make fun of the Chrysler Building. He called it the Little Nemo School of Architecture. His idea of fine architecture were the austere Romanesque cathedrals of the south of France. So if you look at the Empire State Building, yes, it's Art Deco. It's got the verticality in the windows. It's got the massing. But the ornament is very spare, and it's even sparer on 500 Fifth Avenue, and that might have something to do with it. If people are, it's the ornament of Art Deco buildings is one of the things that we notice about it, and there just isn't that much on 500 Fifth. But it's not really fair. It's an interesting building, I agree with you.
We'll take one more in-person question and one more online question. Do I have anyone? Okay, the gentleman. Well, okay, two. We'll take 2.
Thank you. Once again, I applaud you. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
Are you aware of any commercial or even residential buildings that perhaps will incorporate or plan to incorporate Art Deco styling?
Yes, it's happened twice. It happened in the 90s. I can think there's a building on Park Avenue, just a block north of the Waldorf-Astoria. It's got this great big spire and series of setbacks. That's the main one I can remember from the period, and they were called at the time Deco Echo. Has a nice ring to it. And then it sort of went away, but it's come back, and there are a number of buildings, and I can't think of one off the top of my head, but I know I've seen them. Again, this is seems to be everybody's favorite architectural style, so yes, it is showing up. What will we call it? Will we call it Deco Echo? Will we call it Art Deco Revival? I don't know. We're living in a very interesting time when it comes to architecture in New York.
Hello, and congratulations again for the great speech. Having in mind that we have that picture on the projector right now, and the probability of being able to see that view in the near future is slim to none, what are your thoughts about probably New York's favorite building kind of disappearing in obscurity?
What are my thoughts? They're sad. There'll still be yes, it's happening. There'll be other angles. But this is New York. This is a city that is constantly tearing itself down and rebuilding itself. And I think it was Walt Whitman who said that in the 19th century. when the landmarks, I don't know too much about this, but I believe when the landmarks law was first being cobbled together in the mid-60s, the suggestion was made, what about view corridors, which is what you're talking about? And there are cities that do protect view corridors. I think Paris does. We can't do that. It just wasn't possible. It was such a big struggle to get, real estate is king in New York. It's amazing that we have as strong a landmarks law as we do. In fact, it's surprising. If someone had asked me which city had the stronger law, San Francisco or New York, I would have said, oh, San Francisco, they're so artsy there, they must love it. And it's exactly the reverse. Their law is not nearly as strong as New York's. So it's really remarkable that we do have it, but we can't have everything. And I don't think, and the view corridors, they're not protected. What can I say? Yes, it makes me sad. Thank you for asking.
Right, I'm going to take a couple of online questions and then we will sadly wrap it up. Let's do these are from two different people, but let's do them into two parts. This is from Kim. What building, and I'm assuming she means Art Deco building, is most in need of landmark status now? So that's Kim. And then this is from Barbie. What do you think the best Art Deco interior in New York is?
Wow. Well, I'll take the second one first. I have two daughters. They're all grown up now, but when they were little, they would ask me what my favorite things were. What's your favorite this? What's your favorite that? And I thought they were really asking me, who's your favorite daughter? So I determined that I didn't have favorites, and I've lived by that ever since. So I can't answer the question. The other one, what was the other one? Well, there are a bunch, but the one that I'm saddest about really is Parkchester in the Bronx. Parkchester is an extraordinary collection of several dozen buildings. It's modeled in a sense on Rockefeller Center with really interesting applied ornament. And no one's taking the buildings down, but they're being extraordinarily sloppy about maintaining the sculptures. And sculptures are just being, oh, this is a pain in the neck, and getting the treatment of the Bonwood Teller building. And we got involved in a write-in campaign a few years ago to the Landmarks Commission saying, would you please do something about these buildings? And they just aren't interested in doing it. So that's the one that comes to mind. I'm sure there are others, but that's the one that comes to mind now that you ask me.
Right, well, I said I would finish, but I'm just going to ask you one more thing, if I may. This is from Stacy, and Stacy lives in Philadelphia, and she's commenting how there are many amazing Art Deco buildings in Philadelphia. And she wonders, is the equivalent of the Art Deco Society of New York in Philadelphia? Do you know that?
I don't. There are, I think, 27 Art Deco societies now around the world. And they have their own organization called ICADS, which I think is International something of Art Deco societies. And actually, Roberta Newsom, who's our president here of the Art Deco Society, is also the president of that organization. They have a website, and I suspect if you go there, you'd have to go Google it, I don't know it off the top of my head, you will find them. I don't remember hearing about it, an Art Deco Society. There might be one, I just don't know. There's one in Washington, there's one in Boston, I think there's one in Montreal, there are a couple in California, and there are new ones every year from around the world.
Which is wonderful. Tony and the Art Deco Society of New York, thank you so much for your absolutely fabulous and fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank all of you for coming. And just one last word, if you're not currently a member of the Art Deco Society of New York, you're missing out on a remarkable opportunity. Go visit our website, see all the things we do, maybe you'll join us. Thank you.
Yeah. But I did want to I also wanted to express our appreciation for you speaking here tonight, from Roberta suggesting it, and also for the advocacy of the Art Deco Society of New York and all the other conservation and historic societies in New York that have saved so many buildings. So huge thanks. I hope our in-person audience will join us for a glass of wine. I do want to remember that we have another iconic building, perhaps not Art Deco, but the restoration of the Flatiron Building is next Tuesday. And finally, to conclude tonight, a few quick words from Victoria.
No, just to echo Karen's sentiments, One person wrote in about how what you said about seeing the Chrysler Building made her cry. So as a native New Yorker, I have to say I look for the same. That is home when we see our Chrysler Building and our Empire State Building. I pass those two buildings every day and always give a good look. I never take them for granted. So thank you, and thank you for your work. It's really amazing what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much.